Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into one of history's strangest rabbit holes, the world of medieval royalty and what happens when cousins keep marrying cousins for a few too many generations. Spoiler, it doesn't end well. You probably wouldn't survive this trip genetically speaking, but it's undeniably fascinating. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Curious, what city are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this sleepy little history community stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's slip into tonight's journey together. Picture this, a fire crackling in a stone hall, candlelight glinting off silver goblets, and a young noblewoman in velvet being introduced to her future husband, who also happens to be her cousin, or her uncle, or even her nephew. Welcome to the elite world of medieval European aristocracy, where bloodlines mattered more than biology, and love had absolutely nothing to do with marriage. The word inbred hits hard today, but in the medieval playbook, it was strategy. Dynasties like the Habsburgs, the Capetians, and the Trastámaras didn't intermarry for fun. They did it to hoard power, land, and legitimacy. Marry your cousin, and you keep every castle. Marry a foreigner, and suddenly your heir is being raised in a rival court. The logic was obvious, even if the consequences weren't. Over generations, that logic spiraled into genetic whirlpools that produced some of the most compelling and tragic figures in European history. Tonight, you'll meet women who were daughters of double first cousins, nieces wed to their uncles, and sisters given to a first cousin once removed. These aren't math puzzles. They were real people with complicated loyalties, private hopes, and sometimes shocking symptoms of what happens when your DNA plays royal musical chairs. We'll wander through stone palaces in Spain, gloomy castles in Austria, and glittering courts in France and the Low Countries. You'll watch empires swell and fracture around these women, many of whom, let's be honest, never got a meaningful say. Take the Habsburgs, the undisputed champions of European inbreeding. Their family tree is more wreath than trunk. They built a global empire on marriages, each match cinching the net tighter until it nearly strangled itself. And while we'll get to the infamous male Habsburgs later, it's the women who carried the generational load politically and genetically. These women were mothers of kings and queens, breeders of empire, and the unlucky bearers of some truly unfortunate traits. And it wasn't only the Habsburgs. The Capetians of France, the Trastámaras of Spain, and even England's Plantagenets dipped their toes in the same shallow gene pool. The aim never changed. Consolidate claims, prevent civil war, and lock down dynastic legitimacy. Along with that came vendettas, forced matches, and a long line of noblewomen who spent their years navigating a world where family meant everything and far too much. What's wild is how visible the side effects became over time. Protruding jaws, fertility problems, recurring mental illness, stillbirths, and oddly shaped skulls show up again and again in royal lines. Yet few seemed eager to change course. Even the church, which technically forbade consanguineous marriages beyond a certain degree, made royal exceptions. The Pope would issue a dispensation, a holy permission slip for one more cousin match if it promised peace. Here's the kicker. Modern geneticists have studied these lineages and confirmed what medieval matchmakers refused to see. Inbreeding coefficients. Yes, that's a thing, are measurable, and several royal offspring scored comparably to the children of sibling unions, among the highest ever recorded. Charles II of Spain, whose tragic story we'll save for last, couldn't chew properly, struggled to walk without help, likely had the mental development of a small child. And yes, his aunts and uncles were also his cousins. Of course, not every royal woman with tangled ancestry suffered visibly. Some were brilliant rulers, deft diplomats, and beloved queens. A fringe debate among historians is how much inbreeding influenced personality or mental stability. Was Joanna of Castile, the mad, truly insane, or trapped in a political vice where her instability was exaggerated to keep her from power? Was her daughter's melancholy a genetic echo or the product of a lifetime pinned between duty and danger? This question recurs whenever you start tugging threads in these women's lives. How much was nature and how much was nurture? They weren't passive figures. They were queens, regents, and mothers shaping imperial futures. Some ruled directly, others governed through husbands or sons. All bore the burden of dynastic duty in a way men didn't. A prince might blunder into war or drink himself into oblivion, but a princess was expected to marry whomever the crown demanded and produce heirs, no matter how many miscarriages, malformations, or bouts of despair followed. In the next sections, we'll meet specific women who embody this uneasy braid of politics, genetics, and intimate struggle. You'll follow Isabella of Habsburg as her bloodline loops inward, Joanna of Castile as her sanity is questioned, and Eleanor of Portugal as she weds her own uncle to cement imperial power. Along the way, look for the details you won't find in most textbooks. Which queen's jaw had to be softened in official portraits, and which princess was technically her husband's great-aunt. Buckle up gently. The next few hours may leave you grateful for your unroyal DNA. So let's step into the tangled tapestry of inbred nobility, the woman who could be the poster child for what happens when a family tree folds in on itself like origami gone wrong. Isabella of Habsburg. If you've ever wondered what it's like to be the outcome of repeated cousin matches, meet Isabella. She doesn't merely belong to the Habsburgs, she is the Habsburgs, rolled into one velvet-draped, highly ceremonial genetic loop. Born in 1501, Isabella was the daughter of Philip the Handsome and Joanna of Castile, yes, Joanna the Mad, whom we'll meet properly in the next section. For now, note that Isabella's parents were both grandchildren of the same royal pair, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella the Furs of Castile, which means Isabella's line was already bending inward from the moment she cried her first in Brussels. By the time she reached marriageable age around 13, because of course her worth wasn't about charm or smile, it was about blood, that Habsburg blood. She was married to Christian II of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, a man contemporaries described as mercurial, which is a polite way to say a bit of a nightmare. The match was political, as all were, but it also had an edge of urgency. Christian needed allies. The Habsburgs wanted influence in Scandinavia. Isabella's body became the conduit for that ambition. Her womb, in effect, became royal policy. Complications followed naturally. Christian could be magnetic and clearly liked Isabella, but he kept a favorite mistress, Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, whom he wouldn't discard even after wedding a Habsburg princess. Dyveke was lowborn, not even noble, and Isabella had to endure her husband parading a mistress through court while she was pregnant with the future. That must have stung, even for a woman raised to accept politics over romance. Still, Isabella held her ground. She bore 6 children. 3 survived infancy, a feat given the gene pool and the era's hygiene. Her son John died young, but her daughter Dorothea would, predictably, marry another cousin. Isabella's influence grew, particularly after Dyveke's sudden death, maybe from poisoned cherries, maybe not. Rumors hinted at courtly hands guiding fate, but proof is thin. What's clear is that the vacancy shifted power toward the queen. The genetic weight didn't vanish. Isabella suffered bouts of illness that some historians now link to inherited disorders, hemophilia, or something akin. She died at just 24, the official cause a sudden illness. The medieval catch-all for anything from tuberculosis to stroke to hereditary dysfunction we can't diagnose from modern armchairs. Quirky detail. Isabella was fluent in at least 5 languages, not just phrasebook competent, but diplomatically articulate in Latin, Castilian, Flemish, French, and German. Her letters show a sharp mind, dry humor, and a precise grasp of the games around her. She wasn't only a vessel, she read the board and moved as far as her station allowed. Scholars still spar. Was Isabella a casualty of her family's purity obsession, or simply unlucky in a perilous age? Some point to her children's fragility and her early death as signs of genetic strain. Others note that high mortality shadowed even the privileged. True, but the Habsburgs' increasingly closed circles make it hard to shrug off the pattern. What's undisputed is this. Isabella's children carried even denser royal blood, tightening the loop for the next generation. Her grandson, Maximilian II, would marry his first cousin, and their offspring, well, let's say those jawlines could cut glass, and not in a flattering way. One eerie thing about Isabella's story is its quietness. She's a queen you rarely meet unless you go looking. No headline wars, no operatic scandals, no famous portraits, and yet her DNA echoes through European history. Her blood ran in emperors, kings, and doomed heirs. If power can be measured by legacy, Isabella held more than many men, just without the visible crown. You almost want to whisper across the centuries. Maybe skip the cousin. Tell your daughter to try someone new, not related. But that wasn't an option. That was the game. And she played as well as anyone with her surname. From hushed Danish courts to the loud repercussions of dynastic strategy, Isabella of Habsburg shows what happens when royalty cherishes kinship a bit too much. Her life was brief, but what she passed on shaped Europe for 200 years, and many results weren't healthy. Now that you've met Isabella, it's time to walk deeper into the fog-soft corridors of royal heredity and meet her mother, Joanna of Castile better, known as Joanna the Mad. You've probably heard the nickname. Maybe you picture her barefoot in a castle, murmuring to herself, clutching her dead husband's coffin like a macabre lover. Some of that really happened. But the full story is less madness, more tragedy, with a heavy layer of dynastic pressure and, yes, concentrated family genetics. Joanna of Castile, the Mad, is a name you've likely heard. You might picture her roaming a cold corridor barefoot, muttering, or clutching her dead husband's coffin like a grim romantic. And yes, parts of that are true. But her full story reads less like simple insanity and more like tragedy thick with dynastic pressure and the accumulating strain of a too-tight gene pool. Joanna was born in 1479 to Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, the famed Catholic monarchs who unified Spain and bankrolled a certain Christopher Columbus. Their union was a masterstroke of politics, and they expected their children to play the same game. Joanna, their third child, was clever, reserved, devout, and by many accounts, capable of a smoldering glare when crossed. There was one complication. Even her parents were second cousins. Not shocking by period standards, but a flicker on the dashboard warning light. As a young woman, Joanna sailed to Flanders to wed Philip the Handsome, yes. That was his actual moniker, largely for geopolitical calculus. Philip, son of Emperor Maximilian, and Mary of Burgundy, made the match a continental alliance. Unusually for arranged royalty, the two were initially smitten passionately, even obsessively. Sweet in theory, in practice, it was volatile. Philip was magnetic, ambitious, and very aware of his beauty. Joanna, deeply in love, became fiercely jealous once his philandering went public. She reportedly shouted, threw objects, and demanded the names of his lovers. Gossip claimed she once lunged at a lady-in-waiting with scissors over a flirty glance. Was that mental illness, or a woman cornered in a system that prized her obedience over her dignity? Things escalated when Queen Isabella died, and Joanna became Queen of Castile. On parchment, that made her one of Europe's most powerful women. Philip wasn't having it. He angled to rule as king, arguing Joanna was unstable. Her father, Ferdinand, made similar moves. Both men wanted Castile. Both leaned on the madness label to sideline her. A slow, relentless campaign recast Joanna as unfit. Does that mean she had no issues? Not exactly. After Philip's sudden death in 1506, reportedly after exertion and a draught of cold water, which sounds dubious, Joanna's grief cracked wide open. Here comes the coffin tale. She had his body embalmed, refused burial for years, and traveled through Castile with the casket, pausing at monasteries for prayers. Some say she lifted the lid to gaze at him. Others insist she barred women from approaching, fearful of imagined seductions of a corpse. That's the point where modern historians start squinting. Eccentric, disturbing. Yes. But was it psychosis or grief weaponized by powerful men? She lost her husband, was isolated from her children, and surrounded by people ordered to manage her. Lock someone in a drafty fortress with no friends, no agency, and a lifetime of dynastic obligation madness starts to look like the only language left. Genetics thread the needle. Joanna's parents were related. Her husband was her second cousin. Their daughter, Isabella, from the last section, flowed into a lineage that coils down to Charles II of Spain, a family tree more tumbleweed than oak. And here's a wild medical footnote. Some 16th century physicians blamed female hysteria on a wandering womb, yes, literally. One Spanish account describes Joanna as afflicted with a vagrant uterus. Recommended treatments ranged from herbs to prayer to, at one point, an exorcism. Scholars still debate the diagnosis. Was Joanna closer to what we'd now call bipolar disorder or schizophrenia? Or was she crushed by socio-political abuse? Another persuasive angle is trauma. A proto-PTSD from serial betrayals and bereavements. While confined at Tordesillas for nearly 50 years, children died far from her. She was denied the chance to raise them, or even mourn them properly. And still, technically, she remained Queen of Castile. Her seal on decrees, her presence necessary, if only as a pawn. So what's the lesson? Joanna wasn't just the mad one. She was the product of strategic consanguinity, the plaything of competing male egos. Perhaps a woman who saw too much and finally broke. Her legacy, however, didn't. Her children sculpted European history, and her story stands as a haunting case study in what happens when overmanaged bloodlines collide with undermanaged compassion. Let that image linger. Joanna in a dim fortress, world narrowing, love unburied, name etched into memory, not for what she enacted, but for what others insisted she was. Now, your gaze shifts to another corridor, lit by a wavering rushlight and echoing with footsteps that trace ambitions older than the stones themselves. We cross the Pyrenees into a tale less Gothic than Joanna's, but equally woven with dynastic pressure and genetic déjà vu. Meet Blanche of Castile. She doesn't get the spotlight Eleanor of Aquitaine or Catherine de' Medici enjoy, but don't be fooled. Blanche was a keystone in one of Europe's tightest noble lattices. Like so many royal women, she was born into a family quietly looping back upon itself. Blanche arrived in 1188, daughter of King Alfonso of Castile and Eleanor of England. Yes, that Eleanor, child of Henry II and the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine. In her veins mixed English Plantagenet drive and Castilian pride, along with a gentle turn of the spiral toward consanguinity, since French and Iberian thrones routinely preferred cousins when it kept assets close. At 12, Blanche was dispatched to France to marry Louis, son of King Philip II. Here's a twist. She wasn't the first pick. The French initially wanted her sister Urraca, but a last-minute switch still debated put Blanche in her place. Why? Some say temperament. Others whisper. Urraca showed hints of hereditary instability the Capetian court didn't want to risk. We'll never know. Blanche wed Louis, soon Louis VIII, in 1200, and proved far more than ornamental. When he died in 1226, leaving their boy Louis IX, the future Saint XII, Blanche didn't flinch. She declared a regency and governed like someone who'd been rehearsing her whole life. She had. While others embroidered, Blanche drafted treaties, stared down barons, and kept Capetian France intact. Now, the consanguinity ledger. Blanche and Louis were third cousins, close enough to need a papal dispensation. Not scandalous by the day's measure, but emblematic of the era's tightening matrimonial circle. Finding a spouse became less ideal match, and more anyone not too closely related. Blanche bore 13 children. Only a handful reached adulthood. Louis IX, of course, soared to sanctity. Several siblings died young or lived ailing lives. Common then, yes, though some argue their rates were high, even for the age. One theory speculative posits a shared Plantagenet-linked immune quirk. Medieval rumor mills also cast Blanche as overprotective, discouraging Louis's conjugal life to preserve his purity likely gossip, but telling of how powerful women were read. Intense, unsettling, a touch uncanny. Effectiveness invites suspicion. Blanche not only stabilized France during her son's minority, she resumed regency when he left on crusade. Years of governance saw her navigate revolt, famine, and papal politics with remarkably few missteps. The personal cost is hazier. Letters hint at savage migraines and bouts of melancholia. The era's umbrella for depression, hormonal storms, or perhaps an inherited tendency polished by stress. Her death in 1252 came after a collapse on the road to a convent. Witnesses speak of pain, feverish prayers, and visions of saints. Ecstasy or stroke, neurological disorder. Sources won't decide. A quieter legacy. Blanche actively supported scholarship funding theology at Paris and bolstering monastic libraries. Imagine her shade stalking a candlelit scriptorium, murmuring Latin maxims and shushing anyone who breathed too loudly. Not mad, not tragic, simply relentless and tired. So while Blanche isn't the most inbred figure on our list, she marks an early chapter in how power marriages folded back on themselves, and how women, burdened with bloodlines and expectations, still carved out iron-gloved legacies beneath silken sleeves. Next, we turn to Portugal, where Eleanor of Portugal is tugged into a family dynamic so tight her groom shares not just her name, but her uncle's face. Ready? Now step into the warm Iberian air of the 15th century, where stone palaces shimmer under the Portuguese sun, and carriages creak not only under gold and silk, but under dynastic expectations. Tonight's figure, Eleanor of Portugal. If the idea of marrying one's own uncle makes you flinch, congratulations, you're paying attention. Because yes, that happened, and nobody at court batted an eye. Eleanor was born in 1434 into the House of Avis, a branch of Portugal's royal family famous for ambition and tangled ancestry. Her parents, King Edward of Portugal and Eleanor of Aragon, produced several heirs, and Eleanor quickly became a diplomatic prize in the marriage market. Her destiny led her north into the chill of the Holy Roman Empire, where her match was designed to secure political strength. Never mind that her future husband, Emperor Frederick III, was both cousin and, through a maze of prior unions, technically an uncle. To the papacy, this was business as usual. The Pope would sign a dispensation, ink blessing another round of genetic recycling, and power stayed neatly inside the family. The wedding itself was a spectacle of awkwardness. Eleanor journeyed through Italy for the ceremony, which Frederick postponed repeatedly. They didn't meet until the day of the vows, and legend says his first words were, "She's prettier than her portrait, a perfect bar setter for low expectations." Still, in 1452, she became Holy Roman Empress, one of the grandest titles in Christendom. But as many queens discovered, crowns weigh heavier than they shine. Eleanor's world darkened quickly. She had grown up amid color and music in Portugal's vibrant courts. Frederick's Germany was gray, ascetic, obsessed with ledgers. He adored account books. She craved conversation and art. He'd rather count coins than kiss his wife, she supposedly lamented. And every historian since has nodded. They did their duty, producing 5 children, 3 of whom survived infancy. Among them was Maximilian Marth, future emperor, and one of history's master dynastic architects, the man who would elevate the Habsburgs to global power by marrying, of course, yet another cousin. But Eleanor's own life dimmed. Chronic illness followed pregnancy and cold winters. Letters to her brother, King Afonso V of Portugal, reveal loneliness, homesickness, and that eerie sense of being misplaced even in one's palace. They breathe with modern melancholy. I am surrounded by people, yet without company. You can almost hear her footsteps echo through the vaulted corridors of Vienna, faint and tired. Genetically, Eleanor and Frederick's match thickened a lineage already glutinous with repetition. Both descended from Aragonese and Burgundian lines, and their son Maximilian inherited the first visible hint of the so-called Habsburg jaw, the chin that would become Europe's most recognizable family crest. Behind the jawline came less visible legacies, rumors of blood disorders, fertility troubles, and intermittent melancholia haunting generation after generation. Eleanor's decline may have had medical roots, tuberculosis, depression, or perhaps porphyria, the hereditary disease often mistaken for hysteria. Reports describe her as pale, light-sensitive, subject to long collapses. She died young, at 32, officially from illness, but likely from a mix of physical exhaustion, emotional neglect, and the era's delightful medical treatments. Frederick didn't attend her funeral, claiming paperwork detained him. That single omission says more than any chronicle. And yet, her legacy endures. Through Maximilian the Fing, Eleanor's blood flowed into nearly every European throne. Her lineage built empires and carried its own slow-burning undoing in the double helix. Where Joanna's story was madness, and Blanche's was command, Eleanor's was quiet ache, a woman too tender for the machinery of empire, yet indispensable to its gears. She played her part, gave birth to the next dynasty, and vanished into the margins of history's ledgers. Now from those cold imperial corridors, picture a cradle rocking in Brussels around 1480. Child of silk and strategy, Margaret of Austria, granddaughter of Eleanor of Portugal. By now, the Habsburg family tree had looped in on itself so tightly, it resembled a knot more than a branch. From birth, Margaret wasn't a girl, but a pawn, a treaty in lace. Her father, Maximilian the Arth, Holy Roman Emperor, and her mother, Mary of Burgundy, represented 2 of Europe's greatest houses. When Mary died after a riding accident, toddler Margaret became an orphan and, immediately, a bargaining chip. At 3, she was betrothed to the French Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VIII, and sent to be raised in the French court as the future Queen of France. In true Habsburg fashion, it was all strategy, no sentiment. But when Charles came of age, he broke the engagement and married Anne of Brittany instead. The alliance crumbled. Margaret, still barely a teenager, was returned home like rejected merchandise. If she wept on the journey, No chronicler cared to note it. That humiliation forged her steel. Shortly after, her father arranged another marriage, this time to John of Castile, heir to the Spanish throne. And because Europe's nobility was one extended family reunion, John was her cousin several times over, tied to both Habsburg and Trastamara blood. The match looked golden. It lasted barely a year. John died suddenly, likely of illness, though whispers of poison danced around the court. Widowed before 20, Margaret could have retreated into piety. Instead, she chose power. She returned to the Habsburg realm and built a career of rare brilliance. Never remarrying, she ruled the Netherlands as governor twice. Imagine that. A woman steering the financial heart of Europe, negotiating with kings, managing revolts, corresponding with popes, all while wearing gowns so heavy with embroidery they could stand without her. And, of course, the family web only tightened. Her brother, Philip the Handsome, married Joanna of Castile, the Mad, folding the Spanish and Austrian branches even closer. Their son, Charles Thief, inherited a continent and the infamous jawline, both courtesy of Margaret's lineage. Yet Margaret herself seemed spared the worst physical marks. She was bright, sharp-tongued, unflinching. Letters to the scholar Erasmus show her wit. She once called a courtier as charming as a leaking wine barrel. The line belongs on a tapestry. Historians still debate her influence. She trained nieces and nephews, arranged marriages, even those she knew would repeat the hereditary trap. Politics left no choice. The price of empire was blood, often the same blood, recycled. A few human touches survive. A beloved pet monkey named Barb, her collection of illuminated manuscripts, the echo of laughter behind the starch. Her portraits show intelligence glimmering through restraint, as if she knew she was one of the few Habsburgs still strong enough to look history in the eye. By the time Margaret died in 1530, the dynasty she had shaped was at its zenith, ruling Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, and half the New World. Yet inside those palaces, the same genetic trap kept coiling. Margaret's lifetime stands as a hinge between rise and rot, the moment brilliance and fragility became indistinguishable in royal blood. And that brings us toward the dynasty's darkest bloom, the culmination of centuries of cousinly devotion. Charles II of Spain, the man whose body became a living footnote on what happens when a family refuses to mix its genes. Some say she was merely a ceremonial figurehead, carrying out the intentions of her male relatives. Others insist she was the real strategist, quietly pulling strings behind velvet curtains, shaping the course of Habsburg Europe from the shadows. Both views hold weight. What's certain is that kings sought her counsel, ambassadors reported directly to her, and her steady policies kept the Netherlands remarkably stable through years of unrest. Not bad for someone who had been used as a political pawn in 2 failed marriages before she turned 20. Margaret died in 1530 at the age of 50, after stepping on a nail. Proof that even imperial wisdom can't save you from infection. Her death was deeply mourned. Erasmus himself grieved publicly, writing that Europe had lost one of its greatest minds. Not its greatest women, but its greatest minds. High praise from one of the Renaissance's leading intellectuals. In the end, Margaret of Austria stands as a brilliant counterpoint to so many of the tragic, fading blossoms scattered across royal family trees. She may have been born of the same inbred labyrinth, but she bloomed on her own terms. She arranged the very marriages that would continue to twist her family's genetic web. Yes, but not out of cruelty or blindness. She simply played the only game available to her. She played it better than almost anyone. Next, we journey to England to meet one of Margaret's future sisters-in-law by marriage, Catherine of Aragon. Another princess of Castile, another casualty of cousin stacking. and the woman destined to face Henry VIII in one of history's most infamous marital showdowns. You can almost hear the clinking of goblets, the whisper of silk, and Latin prayers echoing through a stone chapel, faintly lit by morning light. Welcome to early 16th century England, the moment before everything unravels. And standing at the center of this poised, glimmering stillness is a young woman with a calm smile and a bloodline more tangled than a sailor's knot. Catherine of Aragon. You probably know her as Henry VIII's first wife, the one he discarded for Anne Boleyn, igniting a religious firestorm and a string of beheadings. But long before that scandal, Catherine's life had already read like a dynastic manual titled How to Marry Your Cousins and Lose Everything. Born in 1485, she was the youngest daughter of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, the same Catholic monarchs we met earlier when Joanna the Mad was unraveling under the weight of royal politics. Catherine was the latecomer, the afterthought child, born just as Spain wrapped up its reconquest and expelled the final Muslim rulers from Granada. She entered a world brimming with triumph, piety, and bloodshed. Her parents were now the united Catholic sovereigns, and their offspring were dynastic gold, purebred instruments of alliance. Now take a look at that family tree. Her parents were second cousins, both products of the Trastamara dynasty, which had already spent centuries intertwining with the French, Portuguese, and Burgundian houses. Catherine carried Habsburg blood from both sides, with a trace of Plantagenet ancestry as well. Her status as a double cousin wasn't an anomaly. It was practically an expectation. From the cradle, Catherine was groomed for marriage. Fluent, devout, and disciplined, she was genetically and politically engineered to connect Spain with any throne in Europe. At just 3 years old, she was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, eldest son of England's King Henry VII. At 15, she sailed north with her entourage, her dowry, and more lace than an entire convent, ready to unite Spain and England. Their 1501 wedding was a grand affair, equal parts diplomatic theater and political insurance. Arthur was the future king, and Catherine, the golden Spanish bride. They were even ceremonially escorted to bed by courtiers to ensure legitimacy. The union seemed secure, until Arthur died 5 months later, likely from illness. Suddenly, everything fell apart. Catherine was stranded in a foreign court, her dowry unpaid, her prospects uncertain, and her chastity questioned. Whether or not the marriage had been consummated became the single most debated issue in Christendom 2 decades later. But at the time, it was just humiliating. Yet dynastic politics never sleeps. Within a year, Henry VII proposed that Catherine marry Arthur's younger brother, the future Henry VIII. One complication: marrying a deceased brother's widow was against church law. No matter, Catherine swore the marriage had never been consummated, and Pope Julius II issued a dispensation. Their marriage took place in 1509, after Henry VII's death. For a while, it seemed like everything might work. Catherine was adored by the English people, fluent in Latin, deeply religious and politically astute, often more so than her husband. While Henry campaigned in France, she ruled as regent and even oversaw England's victory over Scotland at the Battle of Flodden. But beneath the gilded surface, cracks widened. Catherine's pregnancies became a heartbreaking pattern. At least 6 in total, but only one surviving child, Mary. The others were miscarried, stillborn, or died within days. The pressure for a male heir consumed the court. Henry's affection curdled into resentment. Whispers began. Was the queen cursed? Was God punishing them for an incestuous marriage? Centuries later, science offered a cruel explanation. Catherine's ancestry, so relentlessly folded in on itself, may have left her with a rare blood incompatibility that caused her body to reject subsequent pregnancies after the first successful one. A tragic echo of centuries of cousin-to-cousin unions. By 1525, Henry had fallen under Anne Boleyn's spell. Catherine, steadfast and devout, refused to agree to an annulment. She insisted she was his lawful wife, her marriage sacred, and her daughter Mary the rightful heir. That defiance triggered the English Reformation. Henry broke from Rome, dissolved monasteries, and remade religion, all to undo one woman's vow. Catherine, stripped of her titles and confined to Kimbleton Castle, spent her last years sewing, praying, and writing letters. She remained dignified to the end. In her final note to Henry, she addressed him not as tyrant, but as my most dear lord and husband. It's either saintly devotion or the final haunting note of lifelong manipulation. Even today, scholars debate whether her repeated miscarriages were simply tragic luck or genetic destiny. But one thing is certain: Catherine's life was molded and destroyed by a family tree too twisted to stand. She was the offspring of dynasties obsessed with purity, and in the end, that purity became her undoing. Next, we meet her niece, Isabella of Portugal, an empress who married her own double first cousin and gave birth to the man whose chin and fate would become legend. Her lineage is as pristine and as contorted as a pretzel dunked in holy water. Born in 1535, Juana was the daughter of Charles V and Isabella of Portugal. Yes, those two, the double first cousins from Section 8. From the outset, her family line was cinched tighter than a sealed crypt. Physically, though, Hanna seemed to sidestep the classic Habsburg flaws. No curtain rod jaw, no noted limp, no crippling malady. Instead, she carried her father's cool intellect and her mother's quiet resolve. Even so, when both your parents come from the same grandparents twice over, you don't get a blank slate, you're playing with loaded dice. Her youth unfolded under velvet and protocol. She grew up beside her brother Philip II and a revolving cast of aunts, tutors, and confessors who crowded her days with languages, theology, and statecraft. By her teens, she spoke Latin, French, and Castilian with ease and could hold her ground in arguments with bishops. Erasmus, had he still been around, might have offered a slow clap. Here's where her path swerves from the usual script. At 17, Juana married Prince Joel Manuel of Portugal, her first cousin. Not your garden variety cousin either. This was a textbook intermarriage between two dynasties that had been swapping genes like medieval Pokemon cards. Joel's health was poor. He had that spectral pallor you get from generations of limited diversity. And within 2 years, he was dead, likely of tuberculosis or some other inbred immune failure. Hanna was a widow at 19. And there's more. She was pregnant. The child, a boy, arrived soon after Joe's death and was named Sebastian. He would become King of Portugal, and if you're picturing a vigorous monarch ready to lead with glory, pause that vision. Sebastian was raised by clerics, became obsessed with crusading, and died in North Africa at 24, triggering a succession crisis that handed Portugal to Spain. Back to Hanna. After her husband died, the Portuguese court wanted her to remain and raise the heir. Hanna said, absolutely not. She went back to Spain without her son and resumed life at her brother's court. Then she executed the Habsburg version of a power play. Philip II made her regent of Spain while he sailed to England to marry Queen Mary. Yes, Juana of Austria, governing Spain in her brother's name. Not a stand-in, not a marionette. For years, she oversaw finances, military affairs, and diplomacy with king-level authority, and did it gracefully, with few public stumbles. That was nearly unheard of. Medieval and Renaissance courts were not feminist sanctuaries, but Hanna broke the mold. Working inside a system built to shut her out, She mastered its language, wielded its symbols, and knew when to stand absolutely still and let others collapse under their own weight. Of course, no Habsburg woman gets a spotless ride. After her regency, Hanna withdrew to a convent in Madrid. A burst of sudden piety, then a calculated decision. She became a nun, yes, but also the convent's founder and spiritual head. The convent of Las Escalas Reales, still standing, was her pocket kingdom, stocked with art, relics, and quiet authority. She never married again. Maybe she couldn't. Maybe she wouldn't. Scholars still argue whether her retreat was true devotion or a socially acceptable way to avoid becoming yet another pawn in the dynastic marriage game. Now, her son. Sebastian grew up in Portugal under his grandmother and a phalanx of Jesuits. Reports from his youth paint him as pious, rigid, and unnervingly single-minded. No marriage, no issue, just sermons about war and purity. When he finally launched his doomed Moroccan campaign, many suspected he was acting out the holy war daydreams planted in childhood. He died in battle. His body was never found. Portugal fell into chaos, and the Spanish crown under Hanna's brother, Philip the Uex's end, claimed it. Hanna never saw her son again after leaving Portugal. She never returned for him. Whether that haunted her, we'll never know. A quirky historical footnote. Hanna was famed for never raising her voice. In a court of loud men shouting about lineage and honor, Hanna whispered and prevailed. One anecdote, perhaps apocryphal, says that in a heated council, she silenced a room of quarreling ministers with a single lifted eyebrow. That's the kind of queen energy most can only borrow. So what do scholars debate about Hanna? Some say she was the last clean Habsburg, a woman who somehow dodged the ugliest physical and mental consequences of inbreeding. Others think her health was a statistical blip in a steady decline. A few point to her choice to leave her child and call her cold, detached. Others call it strategic brilliance, sidestepping Portuguese politics and securing her own power base. What's certain is that Hanna of Austria was among the most capable women of her dynasty, perhaps of her entire century. Yet even she couldn't divert the tide. Through Sebastian, her genes helped end Portugal's independence, and the careful dynastic structure she upheld became the very thing that unraveled. Next, we step into the Spanish Netherlands to meet Isabella Clara Eugenia, the Habsburg princess who ruled with clarity and composure while carrying that same tightly coiled DNA spiral in every cell. Now you're in the echoing corridors of a palace in the Spanish Netherlands, where beeswax, incense, and northern chill cling to the stone. Thick tapestries, tall solemn windows, and at the center, a woman in black velvet, hair veiled in lace, face as composed as a carved cameo. This is Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip VI and Anna of Austria. Product of an uncle-niece marriage, great-granddaughter of double first cousins, and one of the last truly functional members of a dynasty sagging under its own blood. Born in 1566, Isabella was, genetically speaking, a minor miracle for being relatively healthy. Her parents were so closely related, they likely shared more DNA than any married couple should, even by medieval measures. And yet, here she was, bright, steady, eerily competent. Raised at the core of the Spanish court, she mastered Latin, French, and Italian, while most children still stumbled over prayers. Her curriculum was serious rhetoric, theology, diplomacy. She wasn't being shaped to adorn a throne. She was being trained to manage one. At first, her future spun on the matchmaking carousel. Suitors dangled. The aging widower King James VI of Scotland. Briefly, almost comically, Emperor Rudolph II. Her cousin, already fraying at the edges. But her father, Philip III, kept delaying. He was deeply attached to Isabella, and signs suggest he simply couldn't let her go. She stayed unmarried past 30, practically a nun's age for royalty. Only when he needed to steady the fractured Netherlands did he act. In 1598, Philip did something radical. He granted Isabella and her new husband, Archduke Albert of Austria, joint sovereignty over the Spanish Netherlands. An actual throne, not a courtesy title, not a temporary regency. Real power with real autonomy. The catch? Albert was also her cousin, and the union was theater more than romance. Even so, it worked. They shared cool respect and a common goal. Peace in a land shredded by Protestant revolt and war. Isabella entered the Low Countries like a compact royal storm cloud, black-clad, flanked by counselors, carrying the calm authority of someone raised to rule. Albert took the field. Isabella worked the court. She rebuilt cities, eased sectarian tensions, and coaxed wary nobles back toward loyalty. The region remained turbulent, but she held the center. She wasn't a monarch in name only. Letters describe her as meticulous, detail-hungry, immersed in state business. She rose before dawn, heard mass, then spent the day dictating dispatches, checking accounts, receiving envoys. One report has her personally correcting a wool tariff manifest while a priest nervously begged her to pray. Later, she's said to have answered, "The flock must be fed." Isabella never had children. Whether by design or misfortune isn't clear. Some suspect Albert, her cousin husband, was infertile thanks to accumulated inbreeding. Others hint at miscarriages cloaked by court discretion. Notably, neither seemed overly anxious about an heir. They had each other and the work. Two Habsburgs in a functional partnership not built solely on uterine demands was, frankly, refreshing. But the dynasty's shadow lingered. After Albert's death in 1621, Isabella took vows and officially became a nun. Though in truth, she was a nun, the way a CEO becomes emeritus. She kept her title, her influence, her agenda. She simply wore deeper black and spoke more of God. In many respects, her widowhood rule was sharper still. She kept the Netherlands intact through factional sniping, foreign pressure, and the slow tightening of war. A curious aside, Isabella loved the stage. She didn't just bankroll performances. She edited scripts, sat through rehearsals, and in youth even acted. One courtier swore her portrayal of the Virgin felt more like liturgy than theater. Was Isabella Clara Eugenia the last competent Habsburg? Some historians say yes. The final clear flame before the dynasty sank into instability and deformity. Others argue she benefited from timing, a smaller realm, a relative lull, a partner who shared command. Either way, she stood out. While many Habsburg women are remembered for deaths, wombs, or supposed madness, Isabella is remembered for governance. She died in 1633, at 66, astonishing for a Habsburg woman. Brussels mourned her with a grand funeral of nobles, clergy, artists, and commoners. She left no heirs, but a political memory strong enough to persist for centuries, and, for once, that memory wasn't about jawlines or cousin counts. Isabella Clara Eugenia proves that even in a genetic swamp, a single candle can burn steady. She wasn't loud, she wasn't showy, but she ruled, she led, and she carried the unbearable weight of Habsburg inheritance with something very like grace. Next we head to Versailles, where another branch frays in powdered wigs and satin corsets, beginning with Maria Theresa of Spain, whose Bourbon cousins waited with open arms and open marriage licenses. Let the clop of hooves and the rustle of satin guide you into Versailles' golden enfilades, mirrors stretching forever, rosewater heavy in every breath. Here stands Maria Theresa of Spain, beneath a ceiling painted with gods she likely trusted less with every passing year. Chandeliers blaze, gilded moldings gleam, and a court more obsessed with surfaces than any in Europe preens around her. But Maria Terza is not just another corseted queen. She is the living end product of centuries of Habsburg intermarriage, carefully wrapped in taffeta and shipped north to wed Louise Iner, then 14th of France, who also happens to be her double cousin. Born in 1638, Maria Theresa was the daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and Elizabeth of France. Red flag already. Her parents were first cousins. Her grandparents were first cousins. Her great-grandparents also cousins. By now, the Habsburgs weren't merely inbred. They were aggressively recycling their gene pool like a medieval eco-scheme gone wrong. So when she arrived, her fate was already shackled to preserving the legacy whatever the cost. She matured in Spain's rigid, grieving court Catholic solemnity, black garments, and enough incense to fog every memory. Her schooling was strictly devotional saints in abundance, strategy in scarcity. She was trained to be obedient, chaste, and quiet, with a few music lessons to soften the edges. Then came war, then peace talks. France and Spain needed a marital seal, and 20-year-old, untested, thoroughly Habsburg Maria Terza was the offering. Louis XIV, the Sun King, was everything her world was not: dazzling, confident, dangerously secular, and drenched in power. He supposedly looked at her and said, "She is the Infanta of Spain," which could have been either a compliment or a polite nod to the reputation that preceded her, like a coughing ghost. The wedding was rushed in 1660 on a border island, a famous gesture of neutrality, and a smile masking 20 layers of calculus. Mismatch from the start. Maria Thera was gentle, sheltered, painfully devout. Luigi was worldly, calculating, and perpetually occupied with his mistress. He had lovers before and after. The court spun with intrigue, coded glances, and powdered whispers. Maria Teresa tried. She smiled when required, bore 6 children, 1 survived, and fought not to splinter in the Versailles glare. But behind the jewels was a woman, slowly unraveling. Her Habsburg stamp wasn't just a footnote. It was visible. Portraits show the soft jaw and receding chin of the Spanish line. She was small, often ill, prone to what doctors called nervous spells, fainting, headaches, long silences. Today, many suspect chronic migraines, likely worsened by inbreeding and the strain of being an outsider in Europe's most judgmental court. And the cruelest part, the children. 6 births. Only the Dauphin Louis lived beyond childhood. The rest died quickly, often within months. Even the Bourbon side, more mixed than Spain's, sagged under the blended blood. She grieved quietly. Louis moved on with the elasticity of a man whose first love was his realm. Quirky note: Maria Teresa adored chocolate. Spain brought it to Europe, and she brought the habit to France: thick hot cups scented with cinnamon and vanilla. Some blamed her migraines on it. Picture her in velvet rooms, porcelain in hand, trying not to cry while ladies whispered about the king's latest affair a corridor away. Debate around her is more psychological than political. Was she simply too fragile for the French court, or a woman broken by silent trauma, cultural exile, and the relentless demand for heirs when her body, burdened by generations of cousin pairings, could no longer comply? Historians argue whether she aided her own sidelining or merely survived a system that never offered a chance. What's certain, she never fully belonged. To the end, she remained the Spanish queen. Louis honored her station, not herself. When she died in 1683, reportedly from an abscessed arm, he said, "This is the first time she has caused me pain." A devastating, or simply cruel, eulogy in a silk-lined hall. Yet her legacy outlived her. The Grandon carried the Bourbon line. Through a domino run of politics, Maria Theresa's descendants would sit on Spain's throne, re-entangling Bourbon and Habsburg blood, because Europe apparently hadn't had enough. So here lies Maria Theresa of Spain, queen in France, a stranger to her own life. A body-turned shaky bridge between empires, a silence that shouted for centuries. With her death, Versailles grew more theatrical, Spain more brittle, the dynasty more doomed. Now we tiptoe back into France, to her daughter-in-law, Elizabeth of Valois, who married into the same blood from the other side, adding a French twist to this tightening loop of royalty, religion, and family resemblance. We step back a little in time, but not out of the maze, towards someone who looks at first glance like a breath of fresh air in a stagnant bloodline. Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of France, Queen of Spain, yet another whose marriage wasn't about romance, but about patching cracked dynasties with the human equivalent of genetic duct tape. She entered Philip II's Spanish court with youthful bloom and Parisian softness, only to find herself locked inside one of Europe's most brittle inbred lines. Surprise, she was marrying a cousin again. Born in 1545, Elizabeth was the eldest daughter of King Henry of France and Catherine de' Medici. Infamous for political games, dubious poisons, and a talent for disaster. Elizabeth was the golden child, bright, well-mannered, fluent in Spanish, painted flatteringly from early on. Like every princess in this glittering game, her fate was set by treaties and territorial nerves, not passion. The Treaty of Cato Comrais, ending long wars between France and Spain, sealed it. The peace needed a marriage, and 13-year-old Elizabeth was handed to King Philip II of Spain. You remember him? Later he'd wed his niece Anna of Austria. Elizabeth was wife number 3, married when he was 32, and still collecting cousins. In 1559, when they wed, Elizabeth was 14, an age gap steep even for royals. The gap in temperament was steeper. Philip, reserved, austere, brooding under Habsburg burdens and religious duty. Elizabeth, shaped by France's vibrant, near-chaotic court of artists, jesters, and that walking paradox, Catherine de' Medici. She came eager. Spain preferred solemnity. Spanish court life ran on solemnity, black clothes, endless protocol, long masses, virtue of silence. Elizabeth felt smothered. Philip found her bright energy both charming and mildly troublesome. To his credit, he grew to care for her. Political bride turned quiet affection. But the expectations were crushing. A male heir was the goal, especially with high infant mortality and an increasingly fragile genetic lottery. Over the next years, she endured several pregnancies. Accounts differ. Some say repeated miscarriages. Others, 2 daughters followed by losses. But all agree her final pregnancy in 1568 ended in death at 23, likely a ruptured uterus. It's a brutal pattern now. Teenage brides, cousin marriages, a brief calm, then a quiet death in childbirth, while courtiers whisper about vengeance or curses. A small note. Elizabeth devoured books. She kept a private library in Spain, insisted on volumes in both French and Spanish. Mildly rebellious then. A lady-in-waiting quipped the queen spent more time with pages than pearls. What was meant as a slight reads now like a medal. Genetics check. Her father, Henry VII, came from the Valois line, already weaving into Habsburgs via various cousins and alliances. Her mother, Catherine de' Medici, belonged to Florence's Medici, not famous for inbreeding, but riddled with heart issues and corrosive ambition. Marrying Philip II injected French DNA into Madrid, but not enough to dilute the heavy Habsburg stock. Their daughters, Isabella Clar Eugenia and Catalina Ma, carried the blend forward, especially Isabella, whom you just met. What do historians argue? Some label Elizabeth a mere emblem, undone by early death and expectation. Others see a subtle subversive who brought French flair and feminine diplomacy where both were needed. By most accounts, the people liked her, though she never held formal power. In a court that expected queens to be silent wombs, her gentle intellect left a deeper mark than contemporaries admitted. Yet the legacy matches the rest, a lineage that prized purity over health, inheritance over vitality. Her children were raised under the same pressure to marry within, the same blind faith that God would sort the chromosomes. Spoiler, he did not. The irony. She was first promised to Don Carlos, Philip's unstable son from an earlier match. But that plan died when everyone realized Carlos was politely unwell, violently paranoid, erratic, eventually imprisoned by his own father. Elizabeth got the father instead of the son dodging one nightmare, stepping into another slow unraveling. Here lies Elizabeth of Valier, too young to fight, too clever to forget, too ensnared to flee. A queen who brought color to a court painted gray, and who became another quiet casualty of a dynasty that valued bloodlines over lives. Next, we turn to a lesser-known figure, Barbara of Austria, a woman who, unlike many of her kin, tried to steer her own course, even as the family tide threatened to drag her under. We drift east from Versailles' golden blaze and Spain's incense-laden gloom to Central Europe, where courts are colder, politics denser, and the family tree just as tangled. Tonight's chapter is Barbara of Austria, a name most have never heard, yet she ticks every box on the Habsburg checklist. Noble birth, cousin marriage, strategic deployment, and a life spent smiling through expectations she never requested. But Barbara is a different kind of Habsburg subtler, shrewder, quietly insurgent where it counted. Born in 1539, Barbara was the daughter of Ferdinandist, Holy Roman Emperor, and Anna of Bohemia and Hungary. Her parents were say it with me cousins. Her pedigree was royal to the core, dense with titles and heavy with the usual genetic freight, nervous ailments, narrow jaws, and a family record of illnesses no court physician dared diagnose honestly. Still, Barbara entered life with distinct advantages. She grew up in Vienna at a court alive with scholars, musicians, and envoys. By her teens, she spoke several tongues, practiced a particularly Habsburg brand of Catholic devotion, and, if one ambassador is to be believed, had eyes that noticed everything. By the time she was deemed old enough to wed, which, surprise, meant roughly 14, Barbara was being discreetly pitched to kin and friendly princes alike. She was ultimately matched with Alfonso II d'Este, Duke of Ferrara, a scion of one of Italy's grandest houses, and, yes, a relation. Their marriage was meant to tighten bonds between the Empire and northern Italy, and to keep Habsburg blood coursing through influential veins. Alfonso, son of Ercole and René of France, carried French and Italian ancestry, and, via the usual sideways unions, Habsburg threads as well. Not first cousins, no, but trace the branches back a few generations, and a shared great-grandfather would wink from a jeweled sarcophagus. They wed in 1565, and outward appearances screamed triumph. Barbara arrived in Ferrara with ladies, confessors, and enough embroidery to swaddle the Alps. She took up her role with polished grace arts patron, pious benefactor, duchess with a heart of gold leaf. Beneath the guilt, though, Barbara was staking out her own ground. Unlike many contemporaries blunted by inbreeding, she refused to dissolve behind her husband. She demanded briefings, ran the household with flinty efficiency, and inserted herself into diplomatic correspondence. A Venetian envoy dubbed her the whisper behind the throne. And she was, frankly, sharper than most around her. She understood the rules and played them with velvet gloves hiding a steel needle. When Alfonso favored courtiers hostile to imperial aims, Barbara moved fast-switching advisors, writing to her father, and making it plain that Ferrara's marriage to the Empire was no mere metaphor. Even so, she couldn't dodge the familiar Habsburg combination of pain and silence. From early on, she struggled with vague ailments, draining fatigue, stubborn stomach pains, spells of faintness. Physicians called it nervous weakness. Modern guesses range from early autoimmune trouble to a neurological disorder, both seen throughout Habsburg medical notes. Others suspect a lingering infection like tuberculosis, then stalking every court in Europe. And there were the children, or rather, the absence of them. No heir survived. Rumors counted multiple miscarriages. As ever, blame settled on the wife, though Alfonso himself was whispered to have congenital issues that may have left him sterile. The bitter irony, a union forged for genetic advantage, met genes that would not cooperate. File this curious detail for later. Barbara adored astrology. In an age when science and superstition supped at the same table, she kept a private stargazer to chart her days, humors, and prayers. She reportedly pushed back meetings if the heavens frowned, and once refused to seal a treaty on a Tuesday because of a pressure in her chest. Her brother, Maximilian, eccentric in his own right, found it charming. Her husband, decidedly less so. Despite the widening distance at home, Barbara performed her ducal role with rigor, endowing convents, commissioning altarpieces, keeping Ferrara's court humming. Her health, however, frayed. By 1572, she spent weeks confined to bed. That same year, at just 32, she died quietly, incense curling, while bells tolled the weary tune that had followed Habsburg women for generations. Alfonso, in a rare public spasm of feeling, raised a grand tomb for her in Corpus Domini. Months later, he remarried, this time to another suitably connected noblewoman. Barbara was mourned, then shelved, as so many Habsburg women were, honored, utilized, and quickly forgotten. How do historians rate her? Some shrug an unremarkable duchess who left no ripples. Others, reading the margins, see a player who understood the board and moved better than most. She wielded quiet influence, seized what levers she could, and kept her dignity inside a machine designed to erase it. Yes, she died young, childless, under the shadow of consanguinity. Yet she also left a steadier court than she found, and a legacy of competence cloaked in hush. Barbara of Austria proves not every royal woman shouted her way into history. Some whispered, some maneuvered, and some, like her, left prints only visible if you know where to look. Next, we sail back to Sicily, where Constance of Aragon shows that tangled pedigrees were fashionable long before the Habsburgs made them a brand. The air thickens now with dry citrus and salt, not incense or velvet. We're stepping into the 13th century, when Europe fractures along papal lines and warring crowns. And dynasty means not just who gets a throne, but who owns the blood that flows between them. In Palermo Norman towers beside Moorish gardens, we meet Constance of Aragon, a queen less inbred than born into a clan already spiraling that way for centuries. Think of her as a prequel, a prototype for the dynastic ambitions that later defined the Habsburgs, the Capetians, and every family that couldn't keep its rings off its cousin's fingers. Constance was born in 1179 to Alfonso of Aragon and Sancha of Castile. Yes, cousins. The houses of Aragon and Castile had already been cross-marrying for generations. Long before the Habsburgs professionalized it, Iberian royals were blending their ancestry into such a smooth puree that modern historians require whiteboards and several pots of coffee to map it. Constance, then, entered with a bloodline already folding back on itself. Royal, valuable, and destined to be traded like a platinum-grade political playing card. By her mid-teens, her path was set. She would wed Frederick, heir to Sicily and the Holy Roman Empire. He wasn't just powerful, he was complicated. His mother, Constance of Sicily. Yes, another Constance had died soon after his birth, and his father, Emperor Henry VI, had placed him under papal protection. Politics mattered more than people. Aragon into Sicily was strategy, a foothold in Italy for Aragon, for the Hohenstaufen, a dash of Spanish prestige. They married in 1209, and Constance was crowned Queen of Sicily soon after. She was around 30 late for a first royal marriage, which was its own advantage. Not a teenage pawn, but an educated adult with some grasp of the game. Frederick, meanwhile, was young, brilliant, and already suspicious with cause. His reign would become a relentless chess match among Pope, princes, Sicilian nobles, and his own kin. Constance kept her head low, and her presence steady, never flashy, always central. Genetic side note: the Hohenstaufen, like the Aragonese, had long married within the same tight circle of noble houses. Constance and Frederick, though from different realms, shared ancestors within 3 or 4 generations, making their children yet another loop in Europe's slowly tightening pedigree noose. Their son, Henry VII of Germany, would eventually rebel, suffer bouts of depression and erratic behavior, and die in prison perhaps by suicide. Nature or nurture? The argument continues. Some see Frederick's paranoia, Constance's melancholy in him, traits possibly amplified by inherited vulnerabilities, compounded through consanguinity. But Constance wasn't merely scenery. During Frederick's many absences on crusade, dodging papal censures, or playing philosopher-king at Palermo, she served as Sicily's regent. She issued edicts, gathered revenues, adjudicated disputes. In short, she governed quietly, effectively with the political poise of someone who knew how thin the line was between queen and scapegoat. Sicily stayed relatively stable, no small feat in an age when stability was as rare as indoor plumbing. A small, telling glimpse. Constance loved the stars. During the court's brief intellectual bloom, Frederick adored Greek thought, Islamic medicine, and astrology. She attended public sky talks in Palermo. One chronicler places her on palace terraces at night, studying constellations while soft music drifted from within. It reads serene. It was likely escape. Like most royal women, her health faltered after multiple pregnancies and years of strain. Documentation is scant, of course, but letters hint at a wasting illness in her later life, what we might now call chronic fatigue, or a slow, degenerative condition. Perhaps it was simply the weight of centuries of compounded cousin DNA carried through war, exile, and court intrigue. She died in 1222, 3 years after being crowned empress. Frederick remarried often, carried on the family habit of closed-loop alliances. Constance faded into the footnotes, remembered as the steady queen who kept Sicily on course, while her husband played savant emperor across Europe. Was she a placeholder, or the ballast behind one of the era's wildest reigns? Surviving evidence suggests more influence than she's granted, especially in a world that expected royal women to bear heirs, say prayers, and little else. What's certain, the DNA she transmitted would echo through European history, down to the very Habsburgs who would eventually marry themselves into facial collapse. In that sense, Constance of Aragon is less character than cornerstone. Proof that, even early on, Europe's rulers were already drafting a love letter to genetic roulette. Next, we cross to England's strand of the tapestry and meet Margaret of York, who didn't bring inbred blood so much as she married into the eye of the Habsburg storm and watched the family gene pool begin to simmer. Across the channel we go, skimming the white cliffs into damp English air York roses, velvet cloaks, whispers, cathedral aisles. This time we don't enter the maze by birth, but from the marital edge. Margaret of York wasn't notably inbred, at least not by the dizzy standards charted here, but she wed straight into the machine. What she saw inside those hereditary corridors says as much as any family tree. Born in 1446 to Richard Plantagenet, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, she came of age amid the whiplash of the Wars of the Roses. Royal blood, yes. Peaceful childhood, no. Her father died in battle. Her brothers Edward and Richard would be kings, one triumphantly, one briefly and grimly. Yorkist fortunes rose, collapsed, and rose again. Margaret fit the archetype of the royal daughter. Educated, composed, politically valuable. In her teens, she was floated to courts across Europe. A possible match with the future James III of Scotland fizzled. Then Burgundy called. Charles the Bold needed a wife, not for love, for leverage. Burgundy, quasi-independent power wedged between France and the Empire, needed friends. Margaret's brother Edward IV now wore England's crown, York. Burgundy ties would squeeze France from two sides. Chosen in 1468, Margaret 22 sailed to Bruges and married Charles. She never returned to England. Charles had a temperament like a lit cannon, unyielding, war-hungry. But he was wealthier than most kings, and his court glittered. Margaret stepped into pageants, armor gleams, and embroidery by the acre. Underneath danger, Burgundy lived one airless death away from collapse. Charles had no surviving sons, and Margaret was expected to supply one immediately. She did not. Whether the issue was hers, his, or the strain itself, no child came. Burgundy's stance weakened. Charles fell in battle in 1477, leaving a single daughter, Mary of Burgundy, from his earlier marriage. Widowed, Margaret did not vanish. She became pivotal in the next shuffle. Mary inherited without a husband. Every great power saw an opening. Acting as Mary's de facto advisor, Margaret steered her toward a union that would reshape Europe. Maximilian of Habsburg. Yes, that Maximilian. He married Mary, took the Burgundian inheritance, and fused Habsburg and Burgundian lines, the seed of the coming Habsburg-Spanish super combo ruling half of Europe. That was Margaret's hand. She read the weather and backed dynasty over sentiment. She remained in the Low Countries, took a vow of chastity, and became the Great Lady of Mechlin, counseling step-grandchildren Philip the Handsome among them, and managing court affairs with precise calm. She outlived her husband by decades, a dowager without a crown, surrounded by the lineage she had secured, and watched as it slowly folded inward. She would have seen Philip elegant, restless marry Joanna of Castile, heard the rumors of instability and death, and witnessed the first murmurings of cousin pairing turn into policy. A small oddity, Margaret's particular devotion to Saint Colette. She kept a chamber for prayer beneath a ceiling painted with Christ's family tree. Lineage literally arched over her head. Her quieter legacy is vast. Without Margaret, Burgundy could have slipped to France. Without her, Mary might have married a French prince, and the Habsburg-Burgundy fusion might never have happened. It was Margaret's political instinct, not her womb, that fixed her place in history. No, Margaret of York wasn't inbred. She married into the dynasty that would define itself by it. She watched the first threads twist, heard early echoes of inherited madness, and saw what happens when dynastic ambition outvotes common sense. She died in 1503 at 57, outliving husband, stepdaughter, and many children she helped rear. She rests in Mechlin, where a statue still stands, solemn, watchful, silent. Next, we return to the root system, not just the people, but but the mechanism itself. The grandmothers of Marie Antoinette, and the multi-generational tangle that made the French Revolution less shock and more slow-motion inevitability. The candle guttering, silk rustling in distant mirrors. The century tips toward the 18th. Our focus narrows to a cadre of women few could pick from a lineup, but whose blood ran straight into the coming storm. The grandmothers of Marie Antoinette, a weave of Habsburgs and Bourbons, of empresses and infantas, whose pedigrees looked like antique puzzles, and whose marriages served as strategic genetic recycling. Together they produced the era's most famous royal scapegoat, the teen queen with impossible hair, and none of them escaped the web. Start with a crucial piece, Elizabeth Farnese. Born in 1692 to the Duke of Parma and his cousin Dorothea Sophia of Neuburg, she was already a cousin match before she could walk. Impeccably bred and ambitiously poised, she married Philip V of Spain in 1714, also a cousin, depending on how charitably you draw branches. It wasn't merely personal. It was a Bourbon-Habsburg reinforcement through shared DNA. Elizabeth wasted no time. Within months, she was essentially ruling Spain. Her many children spread a Bourbon-Habsburg blend across Europe, from Naples to Parma. Among them was Maria Teresa Rafaela of Spain. She's often a footnote, but here the branches begin to loop tight. She wed Louis, the Dauphin of France, son of Louis XV Bourbon meets Bourbon again. She died at 20 from childbirth complications. Tragic, unsurprising. Another royal body surrendered to the production line. Meanwhile, in Vienna, another colossus of policy, Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. Yes, Marie Antoinette's mother, but our thread starts earlier. Maria Theresa, daughter of Emperor Charles VI and Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, looked by marriage time, a reasonable genetic wager, despite pre-existing Habsburg ties. As sovereign, she did what Habsburgs did, marry strategically and often. 16 children, nearly every one deployed as a diplomatic piece. Parma, Naples, Modena, and France, where Marie Antoinette was sent. Here's the genetic twist. These weddings seldom involved strangers. Cousins, second cousins, the occasional nephew. The Bourbon matches had already braided with Habsburg stock 3 or 4 times in a century. Marie Antoinette married Louis Auguste, later Louis XVI, her cousin via several shared forebears, Louis XIV and Philip IV among them. The trees didn't just twine, they hugged. You could see it. Her features-long nose, slight chin echoed earlier portraits. She struggled to conceive for years, sparking rumor and panic, and though she did bear children, her son, Louis Charles Nominal, Louis XVI, died in prison, likely from TB and neglect, but perhaps also from a compromised immune system that failed against trivial infections. An odd aside, Marie Antoinette's maternal grandmother, Elizabeth Christine, kept pet peacocks. Their cries, she said, recalled the Virgin's sorrow-perfect shorthand for the Habsburg mood, grand symbolism, devotional guilt, and a garnish of melodrama served daily. Scholars argue about these grandmothers of decline. Some say the dynasties did what the age demanded, alliances over health. Others, with genetic hindsight, see relentless cousin matching producing a brittle elite, clever but volatile, fertility fragile, and prone to early death. One genealogist dubbed the line to Marie Antoinette, a downward spiral in silk gloves, apt and chilling. Tragedy, choice rarely existed. Maria Teresa Rafaela didn't choose. Empress Maria Theresa loved fiercely, yet dealt her children like cards. Elizabeth Farnese mastered policy, not biology. All were trapped breed for glory, even if it meant watching daughters die in childbirth and sons grow sickly and suspicious. Their heirs would sit on thrones and in wheelchairs, sickbeds, and eventually prison cells. We remember Marie Antoinette for diamonds and the blade. Remember, too, those who built the staircase she was pushed down. Next, we slip past throne rooms into smaller doors rooms of miscarriages, mysterious illness, and hushed funerals. The true costs of dynastic obsession, hidden by veils, whispered down corridors, scribbled in margins. The proclamations fade. We enter the private chambers where royal women lived when not staged for ceremony. Here lie the miscarriages, the fevers, the locked rooms, the long silences. For all the crowns and titles, the bill for inbreeding and expectation was paid not in courts, but in the narrow space between cradle and coffin. Begin with a grim constant. Royal childbearing was a career, and failure was forbidden. Yet failure came, repeatedly. Miscarriages, stillbirths, infants who lived only long enough to be baptized and wrapped in white. Records rarely state it plainly. Instead, the queen was indisposed, a sorrowful event, or, frostier, an heir was expected, but none came. Between such lines are lifetimes of grief, blood loss, and nameless children. Catherine of Aragon stands as a well-documented case, at least 6 pregnancies with only Mary surviving. A male infant lived a few weeks. The pressure was crushing, the emotional wreckage invisible. Catherine believed God punished her, a view reinforced by those around her. No talk of recessive genes or Rh factors. Only guilt, penance, prayer. She wasn't alone. Joanna of Castile suffered miscarriages. So did Isabella of Portugal. So did Barbara of Austria. So did countless others. The pattern grew so routine that courts devised protocols around death. Nurseries measured for coffins, even as cribs were laid. Midwives doubled as undertakers. Mourning veils shared drawers with christening gowns. Medicine offered little. Queens were bled, dosed with herbs, and prayed over to rebalance humors. In Spain and Austria, some claimed excessive piety caused uterine melancholy, a fantasy diagnosis that blamed devotion for infertility. The irony bites, saint and broodmare on the same job description. Then the mystery illnesses, crushing headaches, muscle wasting, sudden fevers, swelling, hysteria, visions. Symptoms often began in late teens or early 20s, especially after first pregnancies. Diet, infection, and pressure explain much. Still, modern scholars point to inbreeding as a driver recessive conditions like bleeding disorders, epilepsies, and autoimmune disease. Consider Anna of Austria, Philip II's niece-wife. Several royal births, letters full of exhaustion and dread, likely postpartum depression. Dead at 30 after another pregnancy. No scandal, just another body spent to meet expectations. Or Isabella of Bourbon, mother of Mary of Burgundy. Recurring fevers after childbirth, perhaps lupus, or another autoimmune disease that flares postpartum. Dead young, remembered for obedience and modesty. Some cases defy even modern labels women who slipped into frenzy, spoke to phantoms, refused food. Locked away, replaced, forgotten. Joanna of Castile's turmoil absorbs attention, but she's only the most famous instance. Were these psychological breaks, tumors, inherited neurological disorders? We may never know. We do know such collapses clustered in families with generations of cousin marriages. Eleanor of Austria, sister to Charles V, is one chilling example. Severe insomnia, visions, and what doctors called womb-driven confusion. The cure, bleeding, isolation, silence. She recovered, married a French king, bore no healthy heirs, and died early praised for beauty and behavior. Little else. And the children. So many were frail, delicate in court code. Reports of seizures, infants who bled long from trivial cuts, toddlers who never found words or balance. Rickets, appears over and over. So does wasting. Many were hidden, raised out of sight until they either rallied or quietly disappeared from the page. A macabre habit in 17th century Austria. Miniature coffins prepared in advance, painted with angels and arms, with tiny gowns and lace pillows tucked in drawers near the nursery. Infant death had become ordinary, the abnormal, routine. Historians still argue the inbreeding factor. Some call it overstated, citing sanitation and the pre-antibiotic world. Others note that stack enough cousin marriages and recessive odds explode, and in Spain, Austria, and France, those odds were pressed past the limit. What's unarguable is the emotional wreckage. Royal women were meant to work, miracles conceive, deliver, and reappear radiant in days. When bodies failed, blame was fast and cruel. Husbands took mistresses, advisors whispered, crowds judged. The women rarely left full accounts, just scraps, a line in a prayer book, a midwife's note, the queen weeps alone. Next comes perhaps the dynasty's most visible symptom, the notorious Habsburg jaw, its look, its roots, and the women who carried it through generations like both emblem and burden. And here we stand before Europe's most infamous profile, the squared, jutting, indelible Habsburg jaw. You've seen it in portraits, perhaps without naming it. The lengthened lower face, the heavy mandible thrust beneath tight lips, a chin that seems built to deflect cannon shot. It crops up again and again, passed down like a scepter, until it becomes not merely anatomy, but symbol, power, obstinacy of blood, and the wages of marrying your cousin, and then doing it again, for centuries. Let's define it. The Habsburg jaw mandibular prognathism is an underbite where the lower jaw protrudes past the upper. Mild cases read as a strong chin. Severe cases, the Habsburg specialty disrupted speech, chewing, even breath. Modern researchers have combed portraits, exhumed skulls, compared death masks, and tracked the trait's arc. The verdict, it intensified over time dramatically. Men wore it, women wore it, but women had to live with it differently. A man could flaunt a jutting chin like a medal of lineage, a stamped emblem of dynasty. For women, it landed differently. Beauty counted, refinement counted, and the Habsburg jaw had all the subtlety of a battering ram. In portraits, you can watch painters try to soften it. Blurred lips, strategic shadowing, careful angles to pull the eye away from the projection. But bone doesn't negotiate, and neither does the record. Consider Isabella Clara Eugenia. In early images, her chin is only gently forward. The canvases show composure, dignity, what you might call a mild forecast. By Maria Anna of Spain, Philip III's granddaughter, the structure is stark, angular, almost anatomical. The stiffness you feel in her likenesses isn't posture. It's the artist wrestling to flatter a feature that read like an anatomical protest against contemporary ideals. And then Mariana of Austria, both niece and wife to Philip IV. Yes, niece and wife. Her jaw was so conspicuously extended that observers remarked on it even when royal tact demanded silence. Her face is noble, one diplomat wrote, but curiously prolonged at the chin, which is courteous for she looks as if she's chewing the invisible. Mariana struggled to close her mouth fully, endured chronic jaw pain, and nevertheless bore the most tragic endpoint of the trait, Charles II of Spain. We'll linger on Charles soon. For now, note that the jaw reached its terminal expression in him. His underbite was so extreme, he couldn't chew, drooled, slurred, and required soft foods and spoons long into adulthood. The deformity was not merely cosmetic, it disabled, and it traveled through a line of women, handed forward generation after generation, often without a clear grasp of what they were carrying. Here's the striking part. Modern genetic work mapped inbreeding levels against facial analysis and found something, yes, jaw-dropping. A 2009 study using portraits and pedigrees linked the severity of the Habsburg jaw directly to the coefficient of inbreeding. Plainly, the more cousin matches in an ancestor list, the bolder the chin. And it wasn't just the jaw. Other facial features tended to ride along. Wider orbital spacing, elongated noses, narrow palates, hooded lids. Some girls had delayed speech or dental misalignment severe enough to cause constant pain. So why didn't anyone call a halt? Why keep arranging cousin unions while children struggled to speak or eat? Because power. These matches weren't about health or hope. They were about borders, treasuries, shutting out foreign claimants. A cousin was safer than a stranger, a niece safer still. If the price was a chin that could store walnuts, so be it. The empire came first. Of course, the jaw became satire. 18th century plays and pamphlets, especially in France and the Low Countries, exaggerated it to needle Spanish pride. One cartoon crowned a woman's chin as if it deserved its own diadem. The profile became shorthand for everything critics saw in dynastic inbreeding. Arrogance, dysfunction, self-inflicted rot wrapped in brocade. And yet, some women wore it like armor. Empress Maria Theresa. Marie Antoinette's mother had a pronounced jawline, not the catastrophic form, but noticeable. She still governed with bite, birthed 16 children, and threaded Enlightenment politics without letting her bone structure blink. Her portraits don't conceal the jaw, they claim it. A flex, yes, the chin is mine, and so is the realm. Scholars still argue whether the jaw itself caused suffering or merely signaled deeper trouble. One camp calls it a visible emblem proof of inbreeding, but not the agent of collapse. Another counters that the mandible was only the visible tip of the iceberg. Beneath it lay immune weaknesses, fertility constraints, neurological quirks, conditions a painter couldn't glaze away. The women who carried the trait weren't villains. They were trapped inside rules that told them their highest value was continuation. They obeyed, married as told, conceived on command, and passed along not just rank, but risks. When they looked into polished silver, what did they see? A badge of duty, or an omen? Now we walk into the argument's core, where historians and scientists spar over the real fracture lines. Was it the jaw, the madness, or something subtler? Time to strip down the myths and test what remains. Pull the curtain and step past the pageantry, past account books and powdered bows, into seminar rooms where ink-stained obsessives fight over a single question. What actually toppled Europe's great houses? Did inbreeding crack Habsburg Spain and Bourbon France? Or have we let a tidy genetic fable eclipse a messier truth? Take the perennial case, Joanna of Castile. La Loca, labeled by men who benefited from her removal. She spoke to bodies, screamed in storms, and spent decades confined. Was that heredity or siege? Yes, she was a cousin marriage product. Yes, her family carried mental illness. But she was also separated from her children, crushed by dynastic pressure, and surrounded by factions eager to pathologize grief. One school sees bipolar disorder intensified by trauma. Another argues paranoid psychosis. A third calls the label a political cudgel. The stakes matter. If Joanna suffered inherited illness, she's an early case of dynastic neurogenetics. If she didn't, Mad Queen becomes a gloss for a coup. Similar disputes cling to others. Charles VI of France, the glass delusion king, reads like madness. But was it compounded blood or a crown buckling under late medieval collapse? Charles II of Spain soon gets painted as cognitively impaired, physically frail, emotionally stalled. But our sources are court letters with agendas, physicians with pre-modern theories, and artists painting to order. Infertility and stillbirths pose the same tangle. Royal women miscarried often. Catherine of Aragon, Barbara of Austria, Isabella of Bourbon yet. So did countless commoners. The difference was expectation. Queens had to mint heirs on schedule. When they didn't, critics drew lines on family trees and called it fate. Quant work tries to measure the fog. Using pedigree math, researchers estimate inbreeding coefficients, probabilities of receiving identical genes from a shared ancestor. Most people sit near zero. The higher the number, the higher the risk. Charles II lands around 0.25 sibling level. That's not gossip, that's arithmetic. Many queens sat lower 0.6 to 0.125 first cousin territory. Dangerous, but not deterministic. Skeptics warn that science loves neat villains, and DNA makes an irresistible one. It's simpler to blame chins and breakdowns than debt loads, wars, climate stress, or misogyny. For every scholar who says chromosomes doom the Habsburgs, another insists the spreadsheets of taxation and grain yields tell the real story. France didn't fall because of Marie Antoinette's pedigree. It fell because bread ran out and the court looked away. Propaganda muddies it further. Rival factions smeared royal women as barren, mad, ungainly anything to loosen their grip. Maria Theresa of Spain arrived at Versailles and was cast as slow, clumsy, provincial. Elizabeth of Valois, branded fragile and unstable because she disliked neglect. Slander in satin, not diagnosis. Even the jaw can be a mirage. Portrait analysis is subjective. Painters flattered, stretched proportions to signal nobility, and followed styles that could make ordinary chins look heroic. Some historians think the Habsburg jaw became a symbolic stamp for decline, once primed to see it. Viewers saw it everywhere. 19th century race theorists then turned the feature into a morality tale of purity gone rancid. Grotesque pre-eugenic parable that slid into textbooks, cartoons, early film. By the 20th century, the jaw was less diagnosis than punchline. So where does that leave us? Somewhere between ledger and legend. Yes, inbreeding produced measurable harms. Yes, houses that married close saw compounding physical and psychological issues. But no, not every lost pregnancy was a curse. Not every long profile a deformity. And not every collapse a gene's fault. Plenty of crowns fell because their wearers misruled. Yet the myth sticks, because it's tidy, because it gives collapse a face. Poetic justice carved in bone. Which brings us to the last spiral. The women who midwifed the end of the Spanish line, not passive victims, but pivotal actors in the implosion passing forward. One chromosome at a time, an inheritance too tight to breathe. Now the circle narrows. We've drifted through galleries and sick rooms. This is the slow unspooling. The genetic endgame plays out in marble corridors and midwives' whispered prayers. Focus on the women who were more than ceremonial conduits. They were the final bonding agents in centuries of intermarriage designed to conserve power. The adhesive thinned by time, and too many shared grandparents could no longer hold. Begin with Mariana of Austria. You've met her. She married her uncle, Philip of Spain. An arrangement so reckless, you can hear genealogists hiss. Mariana's mother was Philip's sister. When he wed Mariana, he wed his sister's child. The plan stapled Spain and Austria together. The outcome was Charles II, a sovereign in title and a medical catastrophe in flesh. Mariana's brief was brutal. Produce heirs from a gene pool running on fumes. She bore 5 children. Only Charles survived. Survival is a generous word. From infancy, he struggled to feed. Milestones lagged. Abnormalities were so obvious that doctors whispered disqualification before he could stand. Mariana loved and defended him, ruling as regent after Philip's death and trying to hold together a state coming apart along several seams. She wasn't alone in the last wave. In Vienna, Maria Anna of Austria married Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria, another cousin not. Their son, Charles Albert, would wear the imperial crown, and the family's frayed wiring, migraines, violent mood shifts, periods of great confusion, wrote a courtier. Brilliant, volatile, distant, and physically frayed. His union with Maria Amalia of Austria, again a cousin, didn't widen the gene flow. Further south, Naples echoed the pattern. Maria Amalia of Saxony married Charles III of Spain. Though not Habsburg by name, her ancestry traced similar intermarriage webs among German and Italian houses. Their line produced Ferdinand the Fan of the Two Sicilies. His descendants often present with low fertility, epilepsy, clubfoot. One physician sighed, "The blood is noble but fatigued." Don't overlook Margaret Teresa of Spain, Mariana's daughter, and Charles II's elder sister. She married Leopold IV, her maternal uncle. She was 15. Velázquez placed her at the heart of Las Meninas, that uneasy masterpiece, where even the dog looks weary. Margaret bore 4 children. Only one lived. She died at 21, likely from obstetric trauma, when a body asked to bear children with a man, sharing too much of her DNA. Many of these women were renowned for piety. Mariana lived in black, saturated with mass and confessors. Margaret Teresa was praised for docile virtue. Maria Amalia's fasting carried her to faintness, and yet their devotion could not avert a biological bill coming due. There's a shift, too. Earlier royal women were largely moved like pieces. These late Habsburg queens had agency, and that sharpens the tragedy. Mariana managed councils and armies and batted away papal meddling. Margaret wrote to thinkers. Maria Anna funded libraries. Intelligent, engaged, and corralled by heredity. Historians keep splitting the difference. Some say Spain fell on policy wars, debt, overstretch. Others point to the arithmetic, sky-high coefficients, accumulated defects, early deaths, empty nurseries. A third camp says both, that genetic frailty literalized the metaphor. A system so obsessed with itself finally built a seat no healthy body could occupy. A doctor in Charles's day proposed a single remedy: marry a common-born woman with robust blood. He was dismissed, but may have been the only realist in the room. By the 18th century, the damage was obvious. Heirs dwindled, queens died younger, brides were fetched from farther afield to dilute the risk. For Spain and Austria, the adjustment arrived late. The women Mariana, Margaret, Maria Anna had done all that was asked. They prayed, they wed, they delivered. They were the last glue sticks in a sculpture, already crumbling, gleaming, brittle, doomed. From here we veer into the strangest foliage, those fringe entanglements where a woman could be her own aunt, where brothers married sisters-in-law twice removed, where political panic produced unions so knotted, even Rome hesitated. Start with Anna of Austria. Another Anna, yes. She was Philip II's niece and his 4th wife. He'd wed Mary Tudor, then Elizabeth of Valois, then widowed, chose Anna, daughter of his sister Maria and Emperor Maximilian. He married his sister's child. Their offspring were his grandnephews by blood as well as sons. One of those boys became Philip III, and the jaw and cross-matched chromosomes marched on. The Habsburg specialty was the marriage that covered multiple kinship roles. The reasoning was frictionless. Already Catholic, already wealthy, already in the letters. Why import risk? It was 16th century matchmaking with a single filter. Must be related in at least two ways. Another tangle, Maria Antonia of Austria, daughter of Emperor Leopold I and Margaret Teresa of Spain. Yes, Las Meninas. She married her cousin Maximilian II, Emmanuel of Bavaria, becoming Duchess and, through later ties, step-grandmother to a great niece. Court genealogists spread rugs of vellum to keep it straight. One historian, baffled, wrote, "Let the blood be noble, even if the map is illegible." Maria Anna of Bavaria wed her maternal uncle, Emperor Ferdinand III. The Vatican dispensed with prohibitions as routine. Theology bowed to treaties. At court, these arrangements were praised, not blushed away. You didn't just preserve the line. You wore it like velvet, lined with second cousins. Two sisters often married the same man in sequence to keep dowries in-house, and the man was frequently a cousin or uncle or both. Peter of Castile ditched Blanche of Bourbon within days, married bigamously to Maria de Padilla, related to Blanche twice over. Outrage wilted because the second choice still fit the blood calculus. Joanna of Austria was even floated to wed her own nephew, to fuse Spain and Portugal. The wind changed, and the plan died, not from genetic scruple, but geopolitics. Naming too spiraled into loops. Maria, Anna, Isabella, Philip, Charles. Recycled until documents distinguish them by father and ordinal. Imagine a palace with 3 Maria Annas within calling distance, each married to a different cousin. It happened. Why did this persist? Dynastic paranoia and dilution anxiety. Only our blood was sufficiently noble, Catholic, solvent. Marrying down was worse than disease, so they chose the disease. Minor nobility copied the habit, widening the inbreeding pyramid. Europe became a single sprawling family brunch. Too much velvet, too little gene flow. Eventually the structure sagged. More sickly births, more childless unions, more visible defects. Without genetics, reality still advised caution. Princes looked farther. British kings took German brides. French dukes courted Danes. Loops loosened, slowly and late. Those fringe unions leave a paper trail so baroque, it reads like fiction. But the women were real. Brides, nieces, widows, second wives, to second cousins. They were taught that love is negotiable, lineage isn't. They became their own aunts by marriage, would place dead sisters at the altar, and nodded as Rome stamped the dispensation. Which brings us to the last echo chamber, the collapse everyone foresaw, and no one stopped Charles II of Spain, the dynasty's end written in flesh. Dim the lights, the hangings droop, a hollow empire reverberates. All threads not here in Charles II, a king so thoroughly inbred, he stands as the emblem of genetic entrapment. Every cousin match, every uncle-niece right, converges in one fragile blueprint. Born in 1661 to Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, his father and his father's niece, Charles carried an inbreeding coefficient around 0.254, sibling level. His tree doesn't branch. It loops like a Mobius ribbon with frills. The signs were immediate. Speech lagged past 4, walking beyond 8, drooling, seizures yet crowned at 4, because monarchy runs on rules, not diagnoses. Doctors reached for anything but heredity. Demons, humors, bad air. He endured exorcisms, oils soaked his sheets, priests intoned over his meals. No one wanted to say simply, the boy is failing under a compounded inheritance. His face was unmistakably Habsburg, an underbite so deep he couldn't approximate a chew. Upper and lower teeth didn't meet. The tongue crowded the mouth. His Spanish emerged slurred, repetitive, circular. Courtiers learned to translate their king as one learns a cracked bell. Still, they married him. Twice. First to Marie-Louise of Orléans, 15. Bright, kind, terrified. 10 years, no pregnancies. Whether the fault lay with her, with him, or with biology's arithmetic, the court whispered that the marriage never truly consummated. The king retires as to a cell, one wrote. The queen emerges as she entered. Marie-Louise died at 26. Poison rumors swirled, but illness and strain are likelier. Charles grieved, and the machine resumed. Maria Anna of Neuburg arrived next, a German princess from a famously fertile clan, 23 siblings. If anyone could conceive a miracle, she would. She didn't. The marriage chilled. Prayers replaced embraces. Pressure mounted. Charles's decline was steady and grim, hair thinning, sight dimming, hearing failing. At 30, he looked 60. By 35, he was nearly blind and likely neurodegenerative. He grew morbidly fascinated with death-kept skulls, ordered exhumations, carried relics. He felt cursed. He wasn't wrong. One official wrote late of the man who lives but is already past. Speech disintegrated, muscles wasted, drool pooled, sleep came jagged. Spain still called him king. There was no plan B. He died in 1700 at 38. Balmer struggled. The autopsy, perhaps embroidered, claimed a peppercorn heart, corroded lungs, ruined intestines, waterlogged brain. Whether literal or literary, the message landed. Charles was more symbol than sovereign, the last breath of a line too proud to admit it was choking. With him, the Spanish Habsburgs ended. No heirs, no sturdy cousins. His death lit the War of the Spanish Succession, a continental brawl that redrew maps and forced Europe to face the cost of purity over prudence. France and Austria lunged for the vacuum, while Habsburg slipped into galleries and footnotes. Some debate remains. How much of Charles was gene? How much disease but few? Doubt he was the conclusion of an experiment run past warning. After Charles, history phrase instead of stopping. Panic, negotiation, war. The succession struggle wasn't just about a crown. It was about whether France or Austria would set the tempo. Austria backed Archduke Charles. France put forward Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV. You know the coda. Philip prevailed after 12 years of blood and parchment. What of the women stranded in the transition? Some were exiled, others drifted into smaller courts. A few became bridges, living links between the inbred ancien regime and the slowly modernizing states. Chief among them, Elizabeth Farnese. A cousin at remove, she married Philip V, first Bourbon king of the New Spain. Sharp, deliberate, relentless in placing her children on thrones, she understood what her predecessors didn't. Marrying in a shrinking circle doesn't grow a tree. She cast lines across borders. Naples, Parma, Tuscany building reach without recycling first cousins. In a sense, she rebooted Spain while Habsburg ghosts still clung to the walls. She also aired out the palace, purged Charles's counselors, eased Maria Anna of Neuburg into a convented retirement at Toledo, where the former queen maintained dignity and denial in equal measure. In Vienna, the Habsburgs persisted. Maria Theresa, born after Charles's passing, kept the name and discarded the mistake. She married Francis of Lorraine, easing the tightest loops. 16 children followed, including Marie Antoinette. A brief renaissance of vigor and policy. And yet, shadows hung on. The urge to guard the line survived beneath Enlightenment wigs. One telling policy shift. Early in the 1700s, Madrid discreetly retired cousin marriage as the default. Not abolition temperance. Brides came from France, Italy, the German patchwork. Not scientific reform traumatic memory. No one wanted another Charles. The habits died hard. The Bourbons left cousin doors ajar. Britain looped tight through Hanover and beyond. Queen Victoria's descendants laced hemophilia into half the courts of Europe, Russia included. The Habsburg warning was heard, but only half learned. Still, women's agency edged forward. Maria Christina of Austria married for love scandal and signpost. Portraiture softened too. Chins gentled, jawlines eased. Better genes or better painters, who can say? The face receded. Powder and lighter frames replaced the carved profile. A quieter Europe took shape. The debate hums on. Inbreeding wasn't everything. Spain's fall was fiscal, military, administrative as much as hereditary. But genetics gave the era an image, a profile you could sketch on a tavern wall. The women at the core of that image were never antagonists. They were instruments trained, traded, and tasked by dynasties that couldn't confess their own weight. And the last irony, the house that bent under inbreeding left us the most indelible images of power's cost, not only in sieges and treaties, but in lost infants, dim rooms, and crooked smiles of children asked to wear crowns. Time to ease out. We've counted chins and coffins, traced letters and ledgers, climbed staircases that loop back on themselves. Breathe. Let the corridors empty. You're no longer in the whispering galleries of Madrid or Vienna. You're in your own quiet, where pedigree cannot reach. Let the names smudge. Maria Anna, Margaret Teresa, Mariana. Let the smoke lift. You are warm, safe, and very much unlike them not about to wed your cousin. Sleep well, traveler in time.